So we know how to override some of Liferay's services, but what if we want to completely re-implement a service? This is where we can override our OSGi services and manipulate the way we are retrieving the references to a specific service. So again, the use case for overriding an OSGi service is to completely add a custom implementation, right? To completely revamp the way this service is being implemented. And so the way to do this revolves around the @reference annotation. We know from previous examples the @reference annotation helps us retrieve an OSGi service whenever we're trying to create or instantiate those API service objects. So the @reference annotation has a very strong role, a very strong part in overriding OSGi services. Now, one of the biggest questions when dealing with the @reference annotation is, if I have multiple implementations of a service, which implementation is going to be picked up when I use the @reference annotation? Now, there's a lot of different variables, a lot of different ways that we can control this. The two big ones we're going to talk about is using a service ranking, and the second one is going to be manipulating some of the attributes or elements within the @reference annotation. So let's first go ahead and start off by talking about the service ranking. Now, the service ranking is just that. If we have multiple service implementations of a single interface or API, the service ranking is going to be the one that determines which one is going to take precedence. So the higher the numerical value, the higher the service is going to be selected, or the better chances. So the closer you are to 0, the lower your chances are going to be of being selected. The bigger the number, the higher integer is the one that's going to be selected. Right, and of course, again, this has some variables within it. Now, by default, the default value is 0. But let's say you and I are both making an implementation for the same service, and maybe I set my number as 8,000. You set your service as 10,000 for some reason. Now, if we both think ours is going to be selected, one of us is going to be in for a surprise. In this case, me. So there is a little bit of a wildcard factor if our communication is not good, right? If we are, not careful. Now, example here in the code, we just set the property service ranking : integer, and we're going to set it equal to 100 in this example. So that's very typical if you look at our examples. Oftentimes when we want our service to be selected, we're going to use the numerical value of 100 when we change that attribute. Now, the @reference annotation also has a lot of different things that we can add to it. Now, let's take a look at a couple of different ones. Before we do, we are able to use LDAP filter syntax to help us pick and choose different attributes. So you can say something along the lines of, pick this attribute and this attribute, or you can say select this attribute but not this other one. So we have flexibility and a lot of control. So one of the primary ways that we can select which implementation is using a reference target, or a target property. So we'll start here at the bottom with the Elasticsearch spell check index writer. In the component annotation at the bottom, you're going to see property equals followed by a specific property. Now, we can set properties however we want. It can just be a random string, it could be a random text. So in this situation, we see the property down at the bottom, search engine impl equals Elasticsearch. So this bottom component is implementing, or in this case, implementing the spell check index writer. Now, if I want to target this specific implementation, up above at the @reference annotation, we use the attribute or element target, and then we specify the specific property that we're targeting. So in essence, we're targeting a specific property within a component. And by doing so, we are saying, I want this component with this specific property. So this is a more fine-grained way of controlling exactly which implementation we want. Now, in the reference annotation, there are a couple of different settings that we can set in regards to what we call the reference cardinality. The whole idea of the reference cardinality is, will the component start if I'm able to get a reference or not? And so these different options basically tell us that. So the first one is mandatory. What this basically says is, in order for the component to start, we must get a reference of a service, and it must be injected. Otherwise, we're not going to start. The component will not start. Optional is just the opposite, right? Reference is good to go. If it's not good to go, component will work anyways. It doesn't matter. Multiple, right? It's just basically saying the reference is not required, but we can have different sources, different implementations that may satisfy the reference, right? So it's pretty much any reference out there I will use if possible, right? But I don't need one. And then at least once is kind of the same, or at least one. At least one is kind of the same as multiple, where the idea is I need just one reference, and it can come from anywhere. So that's the difference. I need at least one, or multiple does not need any. Now, reference policy. This one's a little bit interesting. This is in regards to if new services comes up, what do I do with them? So the default is static. This is basically saying as soon as I get a reference of an OSGi service, I'm good. Doesn't matter if anything new comes up, I don't really care. I'm just sticking to what I have. Whereas the opposite of that is dynamic. This allows us to get new references as they become available, as they become or as they are deployed into the OSGi container. And then policy option, right? This one is in regards to what happens when we deploy a new OSGi service implementation. Reluctant is just like what we talked about, right? If a new reference comes up, doesn't matter, not doing anything with it, not being connected with it. Whereas greedy, this is the one where as new references come up, I'm going to be using that new reference. So with all that being said, you can set a whole bunch of different properties of different attributes within the @reference annotation to be able to control exactly which implementation you're going to grab and what happens when new implementations come up. Are you aware of them? Do you do anything with them? So a lot of different options there. So let's talk about the defaults first. So by default, the reference policy is static. The policy option is reluctant. So this whole idea is when a new implementation comes up, if I already have one, I do nothing with the new one. Right? Doesn't matter. As soon as I get one, I'm done. Doesn't matter if a new one comes up. So by default, the @reference annotation is not going to let us know if anything new, right? Any new implementations come up, doesn't matter. With the defaults, service rankings is not exactly super effective, right? If, again, the example, you deploy, I deploy. If you deploy first, doesn't matter what my service ranking is going to be. Since yours is already selected, I can put literally 1,000,000, but since yours is selected, the attributes define don't do anything with the new one, right? And so in turn, by default, whichever implementation is deployed first and grabbed first is going to be the implementation that's used. and it doesn't matter what comes up afterwards. So there are a couple of other attributes that can be used as well. We won't go too much into details here. We have the notes here on the slide, and there's some additional documentation as well. More so of a good FYI. So overriding our preferences, how do we change up the way that our reference annotation picks up its services? We're going to be taking a look at that in the next coming examples. So let's say we want to completely override a specific OSGi service. First and foremost, we have to find the specific service that we want to override. Once we do, we can then create our own custom service implementation, and using a little bit of configuration that we've learned from the previous slides that we have looked at, we can then ensure that our service or our implementation is going to be picked up.